can take safari right up into the skies, open, all the rest is up to you.
Good evening. Welcome to Insights. Tonight's Insight show is a tape that I took back a few weeks ago at Faneuil Hall with a debate between two Iraq veterans. One from Iraq Veterans Against the War, Mike Hoffman, and a veteran, Paul Rykoff, from the Operation Truth. This debate was taped at Faneuil Hall, and we had quite an audience from the two different groups. It was put on by RKO and the Ford Hall Forum. Of course, it hasn't been shown on the air. This will be the first showing of this tape. At the Faneuil Hall was one of my fellow members of VFP, Bruce McDonald. Bruce is back in the studio again with us, and welcome back to Insights, Bruce.
Thank you, Jesse.
Bruce, I think the show started off with a debate between the two, as in the Paul Rykoff, am I saying that correct?
Correct. I believe that's how he pronounces his name.
Right. He came out and pointed out right away that it's about time that veterans had a dialogue about what's going on in Iraq. And he said even though he opposed somewhat of Mike Hoffman's points of view, he says Mike Hoffman was there in Iraq, I was there in Iraq, and we can tell you, and there hasn't been many people putting on shows from the guys that were in Iraq talking about it. You know, what do you think about that?
I was impressed with both of them, Jesse. I mean, you have to give them both credit for going on the speaking tour, educating the public about what's happening in Iraq. You have to admire both of them. They both saw combat. They have different perspectives on the war, but you have to admire both of them. I've heard Mike Hoffman speak before. This is the first time I've actually heard him in a debate format, and so that was interesting. But like I said, I learned a lot. Didn't know much about Operation Truth before that night, and I learned more about that organization. I am somewhat familiar with Iraq Veterans Against the War because, as you know, they were formed last July at the Veterans for Peace Convention in Boston. That's when they got their start. So all in all, I thought it was an excellent evening, and especially for the public, the people that were there to hear this debate, and I'm so glad that you're doing this show tonight so that your viewers can hear it too and see the tape that you're going to be showing shortly. So all in all, it was a very informative evening for me, and I knew quite a bit about the issues before I even went, but I left there knowing a lot more.
Yes, I was expecting more of a confrontation or conflict between them.
Exactly.
And that didn't happen.
No, it didn't. I think they had respect for I mean, they're both veterans, they're both combat veterans, they both were in Iraq. I think and that came out, I think, that they have respect for each other.
And I thought Mike may be the handicap because he was a sergeant and the other was a captain. Right?
Exactly.
So, but yet they both held their ground. And I thought the only, maybe I missed something, but the only real difference I felt they both agreed that the war was a mistake, that there was a mess and everything was like not what they expected. And as we all know, that when the guys are in the service, the main thing is to look out for their buddy, watch his back. But the big difference they had was Mike says, bring them home now. No ifs or buts about it. And Paul said, we got to take time and work it out.
That was the big difference I noticed too.
Mm-hmm.
Paul was more in the camp that we often hear is stay the course, that we can't cut and run. We're there, we're doing some good, and we're making a difference, and we just can't cut and run. Whereas, as you say, Mike is of the mind that we should get out as soon as possible. And I think that pretty much frames the debate around the country.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that they were focused on the issue that should be in front of the public's mind more than it is, and I'm disappointed that it's not in front of the public's mind. And that, in part, I blame the media for that. And that is, how long are we going to stay? Why are we going to stay that long? When are we getting out? What's the exit strategy? We're just not hearing that from the administration.
I don't think they're planning on leaving. I think the fight, I was looking recently because the numbers didn't work for me in Iraq about the financial. To me, military operations, wars, it's all about the money, and here the money is the liquid gold. But the situation is, the numbers didn't fit for me. But I found out recently, this war costing us, like $200 million a day.
Exactly.
That's why the numbers didn't fit. How they make the profit, even though Halliburton's getting all this money and GE and Raytheon are all going to make money, the numbers don't fit at $200 million a day. But now I find out China's paying for it. They're buying billions of dollars of U.S. bonds. with the condition they have favorite trading, policy. Whereas a Walmart, the #1 business in the country right now, buys over 80% of their products from China. So that might be putting some of our businesses, manufacturers out of business, but yet the big time manufacturers, the big arms boys, GE, Raytheon, what have you, they're going to be doing tons of business. And as they're building 14 permanent bases over there, they were appropriated $100 million for that a few months ago, they will establish a long-term situation. But they'll have to keep the conflict going, which is by keeping the occupation and the Civil War, which means that'll perpetuate the situation, the way I see it.
There's no way that they're going to have much of a stand down of 138,000 troops that are there now. It's just not going to happen. I mean, with the increasing violence and car bombings and the insurgency on the rise every day. And then we have the military missing their recruiting goals every month. Something's got to give somewhere.
Well, that's another issue, because I said, yeah, they're going to need like 100,000 plus to man these new bases, plus the additional, the combat troops that are there, and their quotas are down 30%. No, they don't want the draft, even though there's legislation for it, which I've seen, and they want to draft women in. They don't want that because, if you remember, because you guys go back to Vietnam, and just to us, this is like deja vu over again. But the situation is, at the beginning, as long as poor working kids getting killed, nobody's cared too much. You didn't hear a lot of protests. You hear a lot of once the college kids, once the draft came, so they're going to avoid the draft. Well, how do you do that? Where are you going to get the troops for these new bases? Well, close down other bases. And then you can move them from that base, like from the bases in Europe, and move them over there. That's what I see as an upcoming policy possible. I don't know. What do you think? And
you know what, Jesse? You're not hearing a lot of this in the mainstream media. You're not seeing this on the front page of the Globe or the Herald or other newspapers. You're not hearing it on TV. If you tune into public radio, you might hear it once in a while. If you tune into some of these talk shows, the more intellectual talk shows, Washington Week in Review and some of those, and maybe some of the others. I don't mean to sound highbrow here, but you're just not hearing it in the mainstream media. And why is that? I mean,
well, I can tell you.
They've taken a walk on this war. They've taken a walk.
Listen, I feel the reason we got George Bush is the complicity of the media with the Bush administration. If you go in those red states, you'll probably find that most of those people still believe that Hussein was, through the media, responsible for 9/11. This is why. In the media, it's like it's an advertising business. And the big-time advertisers are your big corporations, and your big corporations are supporting this administration, and the big so there's a big, hand situation. So they had a big thing on time, a debate or a situation where they're having meetings because the American people are getting educated, then they're not getting this, like you said, they're not getting, and they're having a debate, how do we go back? And actually, I'm hearing that even Clear Channel is starting to finance left-wing programming, which they wouldn't do before. So the pendulum's swinging back, so American people want to know what's going on.
But some of the discussions we're having right now, I think we heard at Faneuil Hall.
Yes.
Which was healthy.
Yes.
It was healthy, and I hope we hear more of it around the country, in Boston. We need more of that. We need more dialogue, and you can't get any better than combat veterans from Iraq debating each other. I mean, how could you learn more about the war than hearing it from them, people that have been there? Now, you might hear two different versions because you have two different perspectives, which we saw at Faneuil Hall, but it's still valuable information, and then you can decide who you think is more credible.
Right, and I had to edit it, and some shots didn't come out, and I thought I did the best I could, but they weren't really making a big difference except for that issue about how do we get out. And as Mike pointed out, the thing is to stand down, well, that means permanently occupied, because in this financial situation for Raytheon and all this to make this money, it has to be over a 10-year period. So I look for a 10-year occupation, and as long as there's an occupation, I mean, heaven forbid there's ever democracy in Iraq. That's the last thing they want, because if you had democracy in Iraq, you'd have a Shiite fundamentalist country right next door to another fundamentalist. The last thing they want is that.
And one thing I hope your viewers notice when they look at the tape, I think Paul Reichoff made some excellent points about the support the public should be giving veterans. And he made a good point about the fact that this war is different from Vietnam, because in Vietnam, just about everyone knew a veteran. They knew someone who'd served in Vietnam. You lived next door to somebody. You had someone in your family that was there. And so the war hit home more. This war is not hitting home to the average American because, of course, we don't have 500,000 or 600,000 people over there like we did in Vietnam serving. More than that, actually, if you cover the whole period of the war. I thought he made an excellent point about that. And also, and I think Mike Hoffman would agree with this, the kind of support the veterans are looking for from the VA when they get home, with their psychological injuries that people aren't even going to see. They'll see the amputees, but they won't see the psychological damage. And I thought Paul Rykoff and his group, Operation Truth, are really doing it sounds like they're doing a good job to try to bring that message to the public that, you know, support your troops when they come home, too.
Well, we had that problem, and especially through the first few years of Vietnam. And like you said, that's right. They're not, it isn't that draft isn't there, so you don't have the guy on the corner coming in. These are professional soldiers or so. But yet again, a lot of them went into the military for educational benefits. They didn't expect to be there. And to me, bringing all the reserves over there was like a backdoor draft. But you're right. There's no college students, no what have you, this and that. But this could escalate, and the duration there could bring a more serious problem.
Well, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think we all can expect that.
Okay, Bruce, I want to thank you people for watching the interview, and I want you to stay tuned, pay particularly attention of this debate between the two Iraq veterans, and they bring a new picture or new insight to what's going on in Iraq. So thanks for watching Insights, and Bruce, thanks for coming to Insights.
Thanks for inviting me.
Good to have you back again.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. My name is Susan Scher, and I'm president of the Ford Hall Forum Board of Directors, and I'm also the executive director of WAND, Women's Action for New Directions, one of the co-sponsors for this evening's event. For 97 years, Ford Hall Forum has been engaging people just like you in discussions and debates. In fact, we are the longest running such organization in the country. And tonight we are forging a great tradition of co-sponsoring with WRKO Talk Radio and Mother Jones, something we have done several times before and hope to do many times in the future. Tonight's event is Breaking Ranks on Iraq, Two Views from the Trenches. And joining us this evening is Jay Harris, the publisher of Mother Jones magazine, and he'll be with you in a moment to explain their affiliation with tonight's event. And also with us is Scott Allen Miller, one of the talk show hosts of WRKO, another partner for this evening. Tonight will be a debate between our two speakers, and Scott Allen Miller will be introducing them in just a moment. So, without further ado, tonight's entertainment, I would like to present Scott Allen Miller of WRKO.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Scott Allen Miller from AM 680 WRKO. It's my pleasure to co-host the morning show every weekday morning from 5:30 to 9. In a recent cover story, Mother Jones magazine reported on U.S. soldiers who have served in Iraq, many of whom are speaking out on the war upon their return. These soldiers have opinions that run the gamut of wholeheartedly endorsing our country's involvement in Iraq to vehemently opposing the war and, in some cases, even refusing to go back. Tonight, we're joined by two Iraq war veterans, Mike Hoffman and Paul Rykoff, who are here. Paul Rykoff, I did that this morning, and I said I'm not going to do that, and I did it. Mike Hoffman and Paul Rykoff, who are here to voice their concerns and differences of opinion about this war. Mike is a co-founder of Iraq Veterans Against the War, is an outspoken opponent of the war and the Bush administration's policies, and has emerged as a leader within the contemporary peace movement. Paul's organization, Operation Truth, supports the troops, both active duty and veterans, by providing a place for returning frontline soldiers to document their experiences through firsthand reports, and by organizing support in Congress and the public for a military agenda that ensures the safety and well-being of active duty soldiers and veterans alike. I would now like to introduce Jay Harris, publisher of Mother Jones magazine, who will serve as moderator for this evening's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Jay, as well as Mike Hoffman and Paul Rykoff.
Thank you, Scott. I think it's actually quite cool that Mother Jones and WRKO, along with WAND, are the co-sponsors of the event tonight. Mother Jones and RKO do not share a lot in terms of political bent. We're a progressive magazine of investigative reporting based out in San Francisco. But it's my conviction that if we are going to, as a country, confront and really deal with the issues that are being raised by our involvement in Iraq and the issues that are spinning out of it with regard to our military, that we need an honest discussion rooted in the facts between moderates and conservatives and liberals in this country. Only there's a problem. It may not seem like a big request, but we have an administration right now that seems to be, the relationship to the truth is really sort of optional. They're quite willing to twist the facts in service of ends that they're seeking. And in an era where you would hope that part of the counterweight to an administration who has that relationship with the truth would be an aggressive press ferreting out the facts, I think in many respects, the commercial press in the country has either been late to the action or missing in action. So it's with great pride that I look back at the cover story that Mother Jones did last November about military veterans of the Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, who were starting to speak out about the conditions that they had found on the ground in Iraq. I think if we are going to have an honest debate about the smart direction for this country, we need to include the voices that are represented by the two speakers tonight. The format tonight is quite simple. We'll have introductory remarks first by Mike Hoffman and then by Paul Rykoff, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So let me turn it right now to Mike Hoffman.
Thank you. I'd like to start off just by letting you know who exactly I am. As you've heard, my name is Michael Hoffman. I served for 4.5 years in the United States Marine Corps. The last few months were spent in the Middle East at the beginning of what is now known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. I joined the Marines back in February of 1999, coming from a small city called Allentown, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure how much you know about Allentown, but it's part of what's now the Rust Belt. My father was a steel worker at the Bethlehem Steel, a company that no longer exists now. So coming out of high school, I was a bright but not a good student. College wasn't really an option for me. I wasn't going to get any scholarships, and my family definitely could not afford to send me to school. So that left me with no real job opportunities. And then about a year and a half after I graduated, my friend said, "Hey, join the Marines, man. Why don't you come talk to the recruiter?" And that's what I did. He came by and said, "What are you doing here with your life? You're not going anywhere. You're not going to school. You're working a job where if you're lucky, you'll make $30,000 a year. You can join the Marines. You're smart, you're intelligent, you're able to handle this, they'll take you. And when you join the Marines, you'll get job training, a regular paycheck, health insurance, a roof over your head, see the world, and above and beyond all that, you'll get to defend your country. Great, where do I sign up?" So, like I said, in February of 1999, I was shipped off to Parris Island, North Carolina. From there, I spent most of my time in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and spent about a year in Okinawa, Japan. In December of 2002, my time was up. I was going home. I'd served my time honorably and was ready to go on and continue with my life. But 2 days before I thought I was going home, my first sergeant called me into his office and said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but as of this morning, the Secretary of the Navy signed a stop-loss order. You're not going home, you're going to Iraq with the rest of the unit." In February of 2003, I was shipped to Kuwait, and March 20th, when this war started, I was on the front line invading Iraq. I get asked often, well, what was it like? What's it like going into combat? And it's not something I can really express. The things you're forced to do and the things you see in combat are things no one should ever have to do or experience. I look at warfare as basically the complete and absolute failing of humanity. And I've said warfare to me is something I would never wish on my worst enemy. It's not something no one should ever have to experience, but unfortunately, because of the world we live in, we have to defend ourselves at times. I'm not anti-military, I'm definitely not anti-soldier. I was one of those troops. I served for 4.5 years in the military. But when I signed the military, I didn't sign up to fight in Iraq. I didn't sign up to fight a war based on lies. I signed up to defend my country and constitution. And that's not what happened in Iraq. Which leads me to, what do we do now? People are always asking, like, well, we have to stay. We've ruined this country. We've destroyed it. We have to stay there. Well, what good is going to come of our occupation there? What good can the military do in Iraq? I spent 4.5 years in the U.S. Marines, and in those 4.5 years, I learned how to take lives and fight wars. I did not learn how to rebuild a water plant. I did not learn how to set up a power grid. I did not learn how to hold a free election. There's people in Iraq right now who know how to do those things, and those are the people of Iraq. We need to give them the chance to defend their own country. We have to give them the chance to rebuild their own country. But this military occupation is preventing that. It is the problem. It is not the solution. Right now, most of the violence is going on. In the news media, it's usually characterized as foreign militants coming into this country, Al-Qaeda operatives, crossing in from the Syrian border, fighting the Americans. Well, if that's the case, why are there so few foreigners within that have been captured by Americans? Why is it mostly Iraqis in Abu Ghraib and the other prisons in Iraq right now? So we have to realize that once we pull out these troops, most of that violence will stop. A lot of this violence we hear about aimed at the Iraqis isn't just aimed at regular Iraqi civilians. Unfortunately, civilians get caught in the crossfire, but usually it's aimed at military recruits, police, things like that, because they're viewed as collaborators with this occupation. When the occupation ends, there's no more collaborators. And then people quickly say, well, if we pull out now, the terrorists will take over and the Iraqis will lose control of their own country. I hear that argument, and it really bothers me because it sounds like the same arguments that the European powers made in Africa during the colonial period there. It's white man's burden. For some reason, so many people believe that the Iraqis are not capable of handling their own country. I've been to Iraq. I've talked to Iraqis. They're intelligent people. They're people just like us, and they want to rule and control their own country, and we are the biggest obstacle to that happening. Our continued occupation is what is stopping that from happening. So when I say we need to leave Iraq, we need to end this occupation, I'm not saying we need to abandon the people of Iraq. That is the last thing I want. I know what I did to those people. When we hear the word shock and awe, I was part of shock and awe. My artillery battalion was shooting probably thousands of rounds every single day, devastating the people of Iraq. I know what we've done. And we owe a lot to the people of Iraq. But the military and Halliburton and Keller Brown and Root are not the people to repay that debt. What we need to do is give the Iraqis real help. When the Iraqis pull together and they say we need $4 million to repair this area, we give them $4 million. That is what we owe to them for the damage we've done to their country and their culture. And you know what? Even that will never be enough. And then I also hear arguments, people saying, well, if we leave now, we're doing a disservice to those who have served, all those who have fallen. Well, back in 1967, the U.S. administration knew the war in Vietnam was lost. They knew they could not win that war. But 68 and 69 were the worst years for American troops on the ground in Vietnam, in a war we knew we was lost because they wanted to lose with honor. They wanted to find a way to get out of there and basically save face. And how many Americans died because of that? We're looking at the exact same situation now. And we've pulled into what's basically called force protection mode. There was a huge decrease in casualties last month. That's because we've pulled back into our own bases. We're not sending troops out. We're not doing patrols as often. We're not providing security for reconstruction efforts. We're leaving that up to the Iraqis. Some estimates say that 200 Iraqi police and National Guard lost their lives last month. Compare that to the 30 Americans that lost their lives last month. Think about that. Not only that are we pulling into our own secure areas, but we're putting the Iraqis on posts outside of these areas, meaning that we're making them even larger targets for the insurgents. We're actually we're saying, if you want to get the Americans, guess what? You have to kill your own people to do it. All this is because of this continued occupation. And then also, people look and say, well, on top of all this, we have to talk about what we're doing to the troops. We're sending them over ill-equipped, unprepared for the mission they're given. We're not treating them right when they get home. I've seen it. We've got guys in IVAW right now that have lost limbs. They're carrying the mental scars of this war for the rest of their lives. I wake up with nightmares about what I saw over there and what we did. It's so hard for me to get through some days just thinking about the damage I know we've done. But how can we actually try to treat the people who've come back with these wounds when we're creating more every single day? It's like putting a Band-Aid on somebody whose arm's falling off. Well, yeah, you might have stopped that little bit of bleeding, but the arm's still gonna fall off. We have to stop the source of all these injuries. And only stopping the war will do that. So now I ask all of you to help us to end this occupation. When we started at the beginning of this forum, we were told that the media is ignoring these problems. It's not talking about these problems. The only thing that will put this to the forefront is if people like you, people like Iraq Veterans Against the War, other military groups step forward and demand an end to this, to demand that this discussion take place. That is what will end this war. And just to end this, I'd like to read something that one of our members wrote. He put into words so much better than I can about what it's like to come back after dealing with what's happening in Iraq. It's entitled Duffel Bags. As I leave my metal box that I called home for the last year, I carry 2 duffel bags. The first is full of the gear and clothing that has offered me survival and protection. The other bag is hard to see with the compassionate eye. I have filled the second with guilt, the shame for the part I have played in this campaign in Iraq. It is more useless than the first, however, it is the burden I must carry. The ritual a soldier goes through to fill a duffel with the maximum amount of gear is a wrestling match. It took every trick in the book to fit all my soul debt into the long green bag. First, I rolled everything tight and squeezed it down, pinching and tucking to wedge it in. As it filled, I punched the sides. I held the edges and smashed my foot into the opening. I dropped it again and again like packing cigarettes. After fitting all my bad karma inside, I had to sit on it while pulling and straining to clip the top closed. Out of breath, I finally collapsed on top of the bulging duffel. The duffel will be dragged around with me perhaps for the rest of my life, from home to home, town to town, until I am too old to lift it. Then I will lay down beside the large duffel and crawl inside to die. So when you see a soldier returning home with a duffel bag at a bus stop, an airport baggage claim, or being stuffed into a taxi, think about what is inside the bag. It might be rolled clothing of browns and tans, or could be dark secrets that he will never reveal to his family. The soldier will not put his burden upon you, but if you feel any responsibility for the weight of it, you may carry it for a while, if it would make you feel more decent. And if you force him to open it, perhaps everyone can take a little with them to relieve the strain of those who served. It might be a reminder that we are all at fault for America's role in the violence in the Middle East. However, a soldier is trained to sacrifice. He will take the burden to the grave or make a grave out of it if he must. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Paul Reichoff, and first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, and also thank you to our sponsors. The fact that we're having a conversation, the fact that we're having a dialogue, really puts us ahead, unfortunately, of most of this country right now. So I think regardless of how we feel about a lot of these issues, we have to continue to force the dialogue. I think that's the most important thing we should all take from this, because that's what this country is all about, and we definitely need to return to those roots, especially in a time that is so important to our country's destiny and future. I joined the U.S. Army Reserves in 1998. I enlisted after graduating college because my father had joined, and well, my father had been drafted during Vietnam. He lived in a neighborhood in the Bronx where everybody was drafted. And my father served for 3 years in the South Pacific. He was also drafted. And there was a sense of service in my family. And when I graduated college, I wanted to give something back to a country that I really felt had given me so much. And I also wanted a challenge, and I wanted to lead men, and I wanted to do all the things that I felt the Army could do for me, and also test myself, test my inner metal. And I joined in 1998, did a series of training, and then returned to the civilian world and worked on Wall Street for a few years. I still stayed in the National Guard, did the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, did a little extra, a few other schools when I could pick them up. I quit my job on September 8th, 2001. I worked 4 blocks from the Twin Towers. And on 9/11, 3 days later, I found myself back where I worked, working in the rescue effort. My unit was activated formally that night, and we spent on and off about 4 weeks digging through the rubble and contributing however we could to try to save people and do what we could, do what we can. From that point on, it was pretty much on and off active duty. Like a lot of reservists in this country, hurry up and wait. Maybe I'm going to Afghanistan, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm going again, maybe I'm not. Finally spent about 7 months at Fort Benning. After I finished school in the summer of 2002, it was clear at that point the war was coming. Everybody in the military knew it was just a matter of when. And I didn't have a crystal ball, but I knew this wasn't going to be a short conflict. And I figured I'd get it over with soon, be a part of the initial invasion, and try to do what I could on the ground. I wasn't comfortable with the rationale for war. I'll put that up right up front. I thought it was bullshit. I thought it was a moving target from the outset. Finally, the president said, we're going for weapons of mass destruction. And when I got on the plane to go to Kuwait, I remember writing in my journal, Bush, it better be fucking right. We all know he wasn't. I got to Iraq and spent roughly 10 months in central Baghdad as an infantry platoon leader. I was a first lieutenant, and I led 38 men in combat. We did everything from door kicking like you see on TV to school reconstruction that you don't often see on TV, and everything in between. I really felt like we saw a lot of different pieces of Iraq and the American occupation of Iraq. And I returned home in February of 2004 and took a little time to decompress. I went on a beach and drank a lot of beer and just tried to reflect. And looked at my country and realized that this country had no connection whatsoever to the war I had just returned from. And what bothered me most was that everybody seemed to be convinced they knew what the hell they were talking about. And these are mostly people who had never set foot on Iraqi soil. So you saw 4-star generals, most of which had never participated in this war, or policy wonks who sat behind an air-conditioned desk in Washington, or a talking head on television who swore they knew what was right. But very rarely did you see, and I pretty much can't remember at all, seeing somebody like Mike, or somebody like myself, or somebody like the guys I served with, the young sergeants, lieutenants, privates, the people who were where the rubber meets the road, or as one of my team leaders called it, where the metal meets the meat. We just weren't involved in the dialogue. And I felt there was a really dangerous disconnect. And when I read up on it, I started to understand that there's a smaller percentage of the overall population serving in this war than any other war in our country's history, going back to the Spanish-American War. And it's a professional army. So people don't know soldiers. They don't know Marines. They're not sitting with you on the bus. They're not at your job. People tell me, I'm connected to the war, I'm connected to the war. I tell them, tell me the name of somebody you know personally who's died in Iraq. Very few people in this country know people who are serving, know people who are affected. And I think that's dangerous for our country. So when I came home, I bound together with a few other vets who tried to find a place. We weren't going to the Bush camp. The Kerry camp didn't understand us. And we really wanted a way to amplify our own voice, to give our voice volume. And there were a lot of people who had already reached conclusions about this war, who wanted us to kind of fit in and further their agenda or help them enhance or reinforce their already met conclusion. But the thing I found, the thing I still find today, is nobody is listening to the people who've been there. Consistently, nobody is listening to them. And they themselves are intimidated. Many of them don't know their legal rights. They don't know when they can speak, who they can speak to. They don't know they can go meet with their congressman or talk to a local high school class. They're not sure, and they're intimidated. And that's dangerous. George Washington had a quote when he said once that when we assumed the soldier, we didn't lay aside the citizen. But in the professional army, that's what's happened right now. So we founded Operation Truth the summer of last year to try to connect the American people with the war. That's the first step for us, is to create a connection, because that connection is missing. And we feel that after you have that connection, after you've heard their stories, after you've seen their video, after you've read their writing, you'll be connected to them and better understand this war, because that is our obligation as veterans of this war, is to help America understand it. And in a polarized country right now, there's not a lot of discussion going on. There's not a lot of understanding. So the website has really become the cornerstone of our activities. And it's a place where people can find out a little bit more and connect with the vet in their community and just have a conversation. Even if you're adamantly opposed to the war, if you think it's the greatest idea in the world, let's sit down and hear from the guys who've been there. And the thing that I found from most of them is that none of us are happy about the fact there were no weapons of mass destruction there. Nobody's happy about that. But at the same time, most of us don't think we should pull out. We've seen the progress made, and we've seen the upside. And there is upside. There is a wide spectrum of events going on in Iraq. The Kurdish region in the north is a success. And I'm not here to tell you that the Iraqi war is a great success. I don't know yet, and we'll find out. I don't think anyone knows yet. Obviously, it's damaged our international credibility. Obviously, it's had an effect on our military, and that's another very important subject that the people of this country don't understand. Regardless of how you feel about this war, you have to understand that the Bush administration has run the military into the ground. The wheels are coming off. 42% of our folks in Iraq are National Guard and Reserve. Over 50% are there for a second time. We just moved the brigade out of South Korea into Iraq. Our training divisions are now going to Iraq. And this needs examination. We need to understand that we have to take better care of the people involved. You can't just use them up and throw them away. And that's why you see recruiting problems now. The National Guard's missed their recruiting goal. The active duty Army missed their recruiting goal. And for the first time in over 10 years, since like Chesty Puller was in the military, was in the Marine Corps, they missed their recruiting goal. The Marine Corps never misses their recruiting goal. So this is an issue that everyone has to understand and rally behind. And I think talking to the people who've been there, especially the lower level officers and the enlisted soldiers who are always eliminated from this conversation, need to be understood, need to be connected with. So we've done public speaking around the country, college tours, the internet, and media. This is a new war. The first thing I tell people is this is not Vietnam. It's not 1969. It's a different war, there are different issues, and there needs to be a different movement. And that's what we're trying to do, is take veterans advocacy to the next level. As we come home, connect the American public with the veterans who are returning, and also give voice to the troops in Iraq. It's a changing battlefield. You're gonna hear a lot of different opinions, just like everyone else in this country. The military is not a bunch of robots, and we're not lining up civilians and slaughtering them on a daily basis. It's just not what's happening over there. And I think that in part is why the peace movement has had a really hard time attracting veterans coming home from Iraq. Is because many of them aren't against the war, many of them are still trying to figure it out, and many of them aren't ready to be thrust into the mayhem that is the argument over the war. They just want to sit down and talk about it with each other and have a conversation and just be heard. Just listen to what they're saying. And that's not happening enough in this country right now. We also want to get the public involved so they can really support the troops. Everybody says they support the troops and put the nice little yellow magnet on their car, but there's more to it than that. 30% of the National Guard does not have health coverage. No health coverage at all. When you get activated, go to Iraq, sure, then you get some stuff, and that's a nightmare in and of itself. The VA budget is underfunded by close to $1 billion for 2006. Every major veterans organization in this country, the VBA, to the VFW, to the American Legion, has called for mandatory funding of the VA, and it hasn't happened. It's because veterans issues are not a priority in this country. They're just not. And anybody who wants to argue with me about it, I'd love to hear about it. But the reality is, it's just not a priority. When I come home and my father and his buddies say, hey, the last place you want to go is the VA, that's a problem. It's a real problem. And when the president talks in the State of the Union address and doesn't mention veterans issues, it's a problem. Think about what cops and firemen would be without a union. You know what they'd be? They'd be soldiers. And they don't have a voice, so it's important that we represent that voice. The war will end at some point, I hope. I don't know when. And we all want it to end. But I think there is the question of how do we do it best? How do we do it most responsibly? We do have a moral obligation to the Iraqi people. We do have a moral obligation to help them control their country and take it over and become one, if possible, and let them determine their own destiny. But we made a tremendous mistake by rushing to war. Everyone recognizes that at this point. We don't want to make another mistake by rushing out. So I thank all of you for coming. I look forward to your questions, and thank you for your support.
Thanks, both of you. I think that's a great opener. Now we're going to take questions. The format is there's a microphone up here. I think is that the mic. So if you want to queue up to ask questions, that'd be great. What you have basically granted by approaching the microphone is permission to tape you. This is being recorded both visually and auditorially. I think I will take the moderator's prerogative of asking the first question. Both of you referenced, I think, your frustration, I think, in not really feeling like the soldiers' view of the war was coming out to the American public. And I'm wondering if, since most of the people in the room, I certainly include myself in this, are in the position of really having our views of things on the ground in Iraq being filtered by the press, by newspapers, by television. Are there questions that you would plant in our heads about sort of what's missing from the news, about the perspective that we should be asking for in the news reports?
The military controls access, so you've got to play ball to get access. And the American public, to some extent, doesn't even realize that. In order to get on the ground in Iraq, you have to work with the military. So therefore, the very basis of your journalistic integrity, I think, is compromised. Reporters will come back to me and say, you know, it's scary, it's dangerous. Well, suck it up. That's what I told my guys when things got hard. And I think if the press is going to maintain an image of trying to accurately present a coverage of the war like they have, I mean, there needs to be a disclaimer, something like, well, we all used the same Iraqi source from the Green Zone and never left the compound before we filed this report, which is the reality of what's going on in Iraq right now. As the insurgency has increased, the press has gotten more and more confined, and at the same time, the sheer number of press people dedicated to the war has declined. And the White House has been brilliant at controlling the war, controlling the casualties. There was a recent report that found that the wounded are only coming into the United States at night. And it's very, very important for the American public to understand the human cost. And that's not an anti or pro-war stance. That is an appreciation and an understanding for the commitment these people have made. And at the same time, having a national dialogue to determine what is an acceptable cost. When the New York Times puts the names of the dead on page 12 every day, and the press is dominated by what color pajamas Michael Jackson wore, it's ridiculous. And I think we've seen... I was scheduled for an interview on MSNBC about a week ago. And I go over there and do the whole makeup thing, and Mike's done this too, and you sit in a chair, and phone rings. And they tell me, I'm sorry, you've been bumped. I said, okay, what's up? Well, the Richard Blake decision's coming down. And they bumped me completely. I mean, this country has not forced the press to understand what's going on in Iraq. There are alternative media sources, but most Americans don't watch them. So I think the important thing to understand at the very outset is the overall media coverage of this war is crap. And most people don't even understand that. Not to be dismissive, but I think it's a fact.
Mike, anything to add on that?
Right, and it's not just the fact that the reporters aren't getting the story, the soldiers on the ground aren't allowed to tell their stories. There's a certain unspoken silence in the military where you know if you speak out and you say something contrary to what the general line of the military is, you're going to get cracked down on. Perfect example is one of our members, Drew Plummer. He was in the U.S. Navy, and what happened is that he would happen to be home on leave when the war started, March 28th, and he went out with his father, who's part of MFSO, to a demonstration, and there was a reporter there. And the reporter found I was in the Navy, and he asked for a quote, and he said two very, two statements that aren't exactly, very insane. He said, I think the war is for oil, and American troops shouldn't be dying in Iraq. Nothing crazy about those statements. He went back, his command found out that he had made these statements to a reporter. He was put up on, he was given NJP, non-judicial punishment, lost rank and lost pay. And also, if you lose rank, you're losing a lot of pay. From that day forward, he was continually harassed by his unit. That's the official things that can happen to you. Unofficially, if you start making comments that they don't like, you get put on every single horrible work detail they can find. You can suddenly find yourself transferred into a unit that's going to Iraq. You can be in Iraq and suddenly find out you're getting put on every single danger patrol they can find. There's a lot that the military does to keep these views silenced.
Well, let's pick into the questions. Could you please state your name before you ask a question?
My name is Dr. John Walsh. My question is, and Paul Reichoff's comments exactly echo the talking points of the Democratic Party. It's very smooth. And my question is, how can we stop this war if we don't have a real opposition party?
And I think that most soldiers coming back feel the same way. We don't have a voice in either party. And we shouldn't be forced to pick a side. A lot of us are more independent-minded than you think. So I don't know if I'm echoing anybody's talking points, but I know I was in Iraq. And I saw that there is good and bad. That is a fact. I think that it is not all bad and it is not all good. But I think we have to understand that there is breadth to it. And I think that's what the soldiers coming home continue to reflect. That it's not an easy black and white issue. There is a lot of gray there, and that's a discussion we have to have. So, yeah, that's what I'll just go back to.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny, just to echo something Paul was talking about. I've been accused of wanting to be the next John Kerry in a lot of weblogs I've stumbled upon, which I think is funny because John Kerry disappointed me more than anyone else in this last election. Because honestly, you know, IVAW is really in the mold of what Vietnam veterans did during the Vietnam War, and the fact that he would turn his back on that heritage he had behind him just absolutely stunned me. You know, what he said in that one presidential debate, he should have said months before when they started attacking him for his statements during the Vietnam War, when he simply said, "I'm proud of my service in Vietnam, I'm proud of my service afterwards, and history has proven me right." If he would have said that months before and stood by it, it would have been a different election. But the gentleman asked a question, and his final question was, how can we end this war if there's no political party that is here to end the war? The same way the Vietnam War was ended. I keep going to the Vietnam War. I realize it's not the same war, but the similarities are too striking to ignore. The way the Vietnam War was ended, not because there's a political party that called for the ending of it, it's because we have millions of people on the street, day in and day out, demanding an end to this war. That's what ended this Vietnam War, and that's what's going to end this war. And I know a lot of people are scared to step out on the streets because there's attacks on people's patriotism if they speak out against the war. You know, people accuse you, if you're against the war, of being against the troops, that you're with the enemy. There's this black and white way of painting things, that you're either for us or you're against us. Well, guess what? You're not against the troops if you're protesting this war, because Iraq Veterans Against the War is with you at these protests. We were at the RNC. We were down in Fayetteville and a lot of other cities on March 19th. When you step out to protest this war, we'll be with you. If somebody says you're not with the troops, point to us and I'll tell them otherwise.
And I think the first thing we can do, if we want to support the troops, is to support these people who have made the decision to end the war for themselves while the American people remain in this deep slumber that you're talking about, part of which we're not, the disempowerment of the American people is important to the story too. But pending waking up, people are choosing for themselves to end the war for themselves, and I think we ought to support them. My question is, don't we need to better articulate, notwithstanding what's been said here already, a plan to put forward, albeit with difficulty because the people in power implementing the plan are the immoral people who lied us into this war to begin with? Don't we need to come up with a well-articulated plan for how to get out? And I think it's a kind of a bridge between the two speakers, actually. Could you offer a fairly specific, what would be the key elements of a plan that we can articulate and put forward to the American people that would be persuasive and that would convince them that it's right to get out and that there's a way to get out and that we ought to go forward and do it.
I think, first of all, that, you know, what you're talking about is basically like the idea everyone's asking for a timeline, you know? And I'm not going to say a timeline's a good thing. I still think immediate withdrawal is the best solution. I believe that if people were actually informed about what was going on, if what Paul and I are both advocating for, you know, this megaphone for those who have served in there to tell their stories, for reporters actually getting out there and telling the real stories, I think people would realize immediate withdrawal is the best option. But even a timeline would be a step in the direction, right? It would be a step in the right direction, because that'd be something the Iraqis could at least hold the Americans to. That they would understand that, contrary to what I believe, that maybe the Americans don't want to set a permanent military bases, that they don't want to stay there forever, that there is some goodwill there, and that will go light years towards actually making some progress in Iraq.
I spoke to a bunch of college kids, and somebody asked me the other day, why do we go to war? And I turned to them and said, you tell me. You get 6 different answers. When our country, as a population, can't come up with one reason why we went to war, there's a problem. And I think we have to force this administration to give us a reasonable, or at least the intent that there is a timeline there. That hasn't happened. I think that's a reasonable thing to ask for. I think, you know, Mike and I will agree on a lot of issues. I think a lot of people who are looking for a throwdown are going to be disappointed because he's about the only person I debate who's to my left. But we also have to maintain a degree of reality here. I mean, when I say it's 1969, it's not 1969. It's a very different military. And people who will say, well, why aren't you fragging your officers? Why aren't you dropping your weapons? Why aren't you resisting? Do you really want a military that decides when and where it goes to fight? Okay. The military executes the foreign policy dictated by the American public and by the Congress. I think when we get into a military that decides when and where they go to fight, a professional military that decides when and where it goes to fight, personally, I think we're going down a dangerous road. So, and at the same time, I think we need to understand the mindset of these soldiers. I think many people, and I'm going to point the finger at the peace movement at times, don't understand the realities of this military. They don't understand that folks are bound by law and a contract to serve. And if everybody says resist, well, where the hell are the people putting up the money for their legal defense? I mean, it's very rare. Okay, well, I hope you're rich. Because, you know, there's a lot of people putting lip service in on both sides. And you can't get civilians to go out and protest. So to think that soldiers are going to be coming back in droves and leading this peace movement is really not realistic. So that's why I go back to trying to understand where these guys are coming from and trying to have a new movement. This is a new war with new issues and a new military. It's radically different. These people weren't pulled off the streets and sent to Vietnam and coming back to their communities and leaving their military service behind them. A lot of them are still in the National Guard. A lot of them are still in the reserves. I'm still in the National Guard. He's still in the IRR. That's a totally different dynamic than this country has ever experienced. I think people need to understand that as we talk about their involvement in the political discussion.
Just to pick up on this, sorry to jump the queue here, but in effect, one of the things that is different from 1969 is this, as you articulated, this detachment of the public from the war. I mean, in 1969, there was a draft. Do you feel that, I mean, this is off the topic, the immediate topic of Iraq, but in terms of actually having a military that was more lined up with a democratic society, do you think that a draft or some sort of national service requirement would be a good thing? Yeah, or both of you.
Well, I mean, it's a long discussion about whether or not it would be a good thing and whether or not it would be a fair thing. Because if it looked like the last draft, I don't want it. I mean, it wasn't an equitable, fair thing. I think it's an important discussion to have. Why don't we all sit down as a country and talk about, if we have to have a draft, what it's going to look like? Because we haven't had that right now. It's been kind of used as a political football sometimes, thrown around, but the reality is, it may not be a probability, but it is a possibility. And any politician who stands up and tells you it's not is lying. Because what do you do if Korea comes across the DMZ? What do you do if Iran decides to take us on in Iraq? Our military is so overextended that we are at a point where the all-volunteer army is breaking. So we have to rethink the entire all-volunteer army. You have to do one of two things. Either change your foreign policy or change the military. It's clear we're not going to do the first thing. It doesn't look like it anyway. And the only way to change our military is either bring in international forces, and that's not going to happen, to expand the size of the active duty, which many people have proposed, or have a draft. So it's out there. And I think it's an important conversation to have now. I'm not a policymaker, so I don't know specifically the nuances of who would go and where, but I'll bet you women go this time, and I bet you college grads don't get off. And that might force a bit of a gut check. I think it is a political strategy on the part of the White House not to have a discussion, because the first thing it does is make people think, wow, it could be me. It's what I call the oh shit reaction. They go, whoa, you mean my kid could go? Yeah, your kid could go. It totally alters the dynamic and the thought process of that person. And I think that's a very important thing to do. If I was going to wage an unpopular war, the first thing I would do would be to build a professional military.
My name is Winston Warfield. I'm a veteran of Vietnam. I volunteered during that era. I was not a draftee. I was in the 5th Infantry Division in Quang Tri Province in Vietnam. Those are my credentials. I want to address a question to Mr. Rykoff. 3 questions, actually, in the format that we're following here. And I want to sharpen this up a little bit. Why do you keep stressing that Iraq is not like Vietnam? In my view, it's very like Vietnam in that it's an imperial adventure. Second question, why do you say we should not get out now? It strikes me as the white man's burden argument that was floated during the Vietnam War when people were desperate to get out. And the third question is, why did you denounce the Fayetteville demonstration when in fact that demonstration was the most important one in the country and directly addressed the troops by soldiers and veterans and military families? Thank you.
Like Vietnam, but it's not Vietnam. I think it's an entirely different battlefield. It's an entirely different global situation. It's an entirely different military. It's an entirely different enemy. It's an entirely different public. There are countless reasons why. When I say that, what I mean is, in the same way the administration and the military and the insurgents have rethought this whole thing, I think the political process needs to rethink it also. I mean, we need new ideas. The same ideas for activism, veterans advocacy, media relations from '69 will not work.